You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. Happy fall, everyone. Cooler weather is starting to roll in, and I am so ready for it. This week, I want to talk about graph query language confusion with some overlapping terminology. Then I am so excited to start gearing up for our Nodes 2024 event by showcasing our pre-conference workshops called Road to Nodes. Let's get started. The first topic today is differentiating the terminology of GraphQL versus GQL versus graph query languages. There's been a couple of different events I've attended this year. I've overheard some comments that confuse or misstate these terms. They're often used interchangeably, probably from those who are less familiar with the graph technology space. But as someone who is very steeped in the graph technology space, they are not the same. Let's start looking at them. First, let's start with graph query languages in general. This includes things like Cypher, Gremlin, Sparkle, etc. These are kind of like your different flavors of SQL query languages. Things like PL SQL, MySQL, MS SQL, T SQL, etc. The list goes on and on, right? Everyone kind of has their own implementation or flavor of SQL. This is kind of that same way with graph query languages as well. So SQL is used to query relational databases. Cypher is one graph query language option that you can use to query graph databases. And not only Neo4j. So Cypher is supported by other graph databases as well, and some other languages are supported by various other databases than what they're initially written to support. Graph query languages allow you to interact with or query graph databases. So just like you have multiple flavors of SQL, and all the different options there, you have multiple flavors of graph query languages, Cypher just being one of those. Next, let's look at GQL or GQL. This is the standard for all graph query languages. So like you have a SQL ISO standard that sets consistent rules and syntax things to follow for all the flavors of SQL to adhere to, in the same way you have now a graph query language standard called GQL. This was an ISO standard that was released earlier this year, so in 2024, and all of the graph query languages, things like Cypher, Gremlin, Sparkle, etc., need to adhere to the rules that have been set out by this GQL standard. This helps consolidate the syntax and the structure of these newer segments of query languages that are specifically designed for graph databases. It's really a great thing to see a standard implemented here so that other graph query languages can adhere to the same rules and follow the same processes so that things are easier for developers to pick up and learn. Last but not least, this is the wrench that gets thrown in, the technology called GraphQL. This is actually not a graph query language, although this is what that term stands for. GraphQL is short for graph query language. However, as per the website, it says it's a graph query language for your API. This is a layer on top of a database. Many different databases, including Neo4j, have integrations that plug into GraphQL or that allow GraphQL to plug into their database. It's an intermediary layer that reduces changes in your application layers because your data layer is going to stay consistent. So, for instance, you plug GraphQL into a relational database or a graph database, and you'll define some mappings so that you map certain entities or rows, etc., to a defined object type and set of properties. And then your application layer can use that, can query that GraphQL endpoint. It will pull the data from whatever database, and it will create a consistent object that the application can use and pull and pass on. So no matter what your database layer underneath, whether it's rows and columns or graphs or documents or whatever, you can create a very consistent data object that then can be passed to your application layer without having to modify your application if you happen to change your database layer. This also allows you to pool data from various sources into a single unified data object. So for instance, I could have a GraphQL layer that pulls a little bit of data from relational tables, and some from a graph database, and some from a document database, and some from a columnar store. And I could pull all this data into a single data object that then I can just pass on to whatever application needs it. This creates a really consistent, unified data object or set that then my applications can use on top without having to modify the application anytime there's a change on the back end. So super useful, but it is actually not a query language. It is a data layer for your API that allows you to basically query your data sources kind of like a graph and pull that data together so that then you can use in other places. So those are the differences between GraphQL, GQL, and then the various graph query languages like Cypher, Gremlin, Sparkle, etc. So I hope this provides a little bit more clarity and maybe helps you pass along the word to someone else. The content piece I want to talk about today is the Road to Nodes workshops. This is gearing up for the Neo4j Nodes 2024 conference, and we have some pre-conference workshops that get presented maybe the last 4 to 6 weeks before the actual conference event, which will be in November this year. You'll start seeing some workshops spin up towards the end of September. There's 4 different topics offered this year. A couple are going to be duplicated for the ones that are really popular topics into hemisphere-specific time zones. So you're going to see a couple of different instances of the same topic, but again, just those are the more popular topics that we're hoping to kind of divide the audience and make it a little easier to help people along and learn the topics. So there's 6 sessions total. The Neo4j Fundamentals is the first topic, and there's 2 sessions for that one, divided by hemisphere, Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere time zones. So if you're new to graphs or Neo4j and just want to learn the fundamentals and the foundations of the graph database, by all means, check that one out. And again, a couple of different options for you on time zone. Then there's a Building an Application backed with Aura and Neo4j Connector for Confluent. That is building applications on top of our cloud database as a service, which is called Aura. And then mastering retrieval augmented generation with the Neo4j GenAI Python package. There's 2 segments of this one as well, depending on your hemisphere or which time zone might fit better in your schedule. If you want to learn a little bit more about retrieval augmented generation or RAG with Neo4j, look at that session. And last but not least, we have Visualize, Analyze, and Explore, Learn Neo4j Bloom. So Neo4j Bloom is our visualization tool, and they're going to explore different data sets and help you query using natural language and explore graph data. So that's a really fantastic tool and should be a really fun session. There's some really knowledgeable speakers that are presenting these topics. They'll help step you through each of these and allow you to get your hands on the technology and learn the concepts while you're exploring and doing things. These are also live sessions. Many of us in Neo4j internal as well as in the community are going to be interacting in the chat to help answer questions and help you where needed. So if you need to pop out for a minute and come back in, you fall a little bit behind or need some extra help with something or just have a question, feel free to drop something into the chat during those sessions and somebody will help you out. I hope this episode can dispel some confusion between the GraphQL, GQL, and Cypher terms, their functionality, and then how they might fit into your tech stack. Next time you hear these terms pop up in random conversation, try to help spread the word and clarify, politely of course, how they are different. Then if you want to learn more about graphs and hands-on format, check out the Road to Nodes workshops and sign up for topics you are interested in. Of course, gearing up toward our main event in November, Nodes 2024. Thank you again for listening and happy coding.